Thank you very much, Volker. I think you're correct to point out that at least, I think, to a competition policy or competition law community, I've posed what I would say is a fairly provocative question. And my plan is maybe not to sort of answer it in full and say we have to sort of give up everything we've done previously and now focus on a huge, very broad notion of economic power. But I think that it's a question that's worth sort of exploring. And I'd like to use the introduction just to explain to you sort of where I'm coming from, why I think this is such a relevant question. I think in the last couple of years, and from all corners of literature, so both within the antitrust or competition community, as sort of any sort of leading media outlets, etc., I think there has been this huge discontent and almost skepticism with the amount of power that certain big players, in particular sort of the big platforms, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple hold. And I think it's come to that point in society where, I mean, there's a huge discontent amongst some people. There's almost an angst. People have this constant feeling sort of being surveilled, of being controlled, that many places of public discourse are surveilled and you know, due to sort of private interests. There's this intense feeling of sort of lack of freedom and lack of autonomy. And I think it's also sort of largely true that this rise of the kind of intangible power of these big platforms that we see sort of is largely blamed on sort of antitrust or competition law enforcement, that people feel competition law enforcement over the last decades was too slow and had a kind of a lack of teeth, didn't have any vision. They didn't understand sort of what they're doing. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to look at this discontent and try to come a little bit closer to this notion of larger economic power that isn't only sort of classical market power, which competition lawyers and economists classically talk about. I'd like to then look at this accusation of is it all sort of the fault of competition law and competition policy, and give you a brief look at maybe sort of how competition law has maybe developed over the last 50 years. And then I'd like to, first of all, look at maybe sort of the larger implications of this power. What does a power imbalance mean, both in terms of thinking about economic markets and systems, but also thinking about sort of legal systems and free civil society. And then I would turn to sort of the nature of this power. What are we actually talking about when we talk about the power of the big platforms and big tech companies today? How does this fit into, there's a huge debate at the moment on whether the goals of antitrust or competition law should evolve. How do these new notions of power fit into that debate? And then lastly, to ask the question, can and should competition law either sort of alone or together with regulatory law and power sort of address these questions? So just as an introduction, as I said before, we have this new huge rise and skepticism, discontent of economic and private power. Largely, I think there's a feeling sort of across the Atlantic that certain companies simply have too much economic power, and there's a lot of autonomy and also sort of lost competition that has to be regained. I think both in Europe and in the US, this has led to a kind of almost romantic or nostalgic sort of return to what some people see sort of as the origins of competition, saying that sort of before a welfarist era or a Chicago-led school era, both according to sort of Brandesian principles or ordoliberal principles, competition law didn't only serve economic efficiency or welfare aims, but had sort of larger public and social interests in view, and in particular was far more skeptical sort of both of sort of private power, and of public power. I think sometimes the influence of Brandeisian thinking or ordoliberal thinking is perhaps overstated. I'm not sure it's always the correct thing to sort of go back to sort of a couple of authors and say, well, this is what sort of the origins of competition law is. But I think if we look at the development, we can certainly see that competition law has, I think in its origins, in its ordoliberal and Brandeisian origins, definitely had this sort of outright skepticism of private power, and it saw sort of both competition law and competition as an instrument to sort of deprive or control that power. Franz Böhm, the German thinker, called competition rather than competition law. I think it's a very nice quote, das genialste Entmachtungsinstrument der Geschichte, so the greatest instrument to deprive and control sort of public power. And I guess the general question is, should we go back to such a broad understanding of competition law? Then I think in the 50s and 60s, competition law was generally, the competition policy and law focused more sort of on competition as such. What does competition as a process mean? What does rivalry mean? How do we protect sort of this actual process? And then with the rise of the Chicago School, it moved ever more to sort of the effects or the results of competition law, looked ever more sort of closely only at welfare. And I remember when I was studying abroad, I think this must have been like sort of right at the beginning of my studies in 2006, I think that was when sort of this Chicago School more economic approach debate was starting in Europe. I wasn't studying competition law at the time, but for some reason for my birthday, somebody gave me sort of Posner's antitrust law, and it was an exciting time. I mean, you really thought, here are some people that can think clearly, that know exactly what competition law should be and should do. And so I think this whole sort of welfarist revolution, or the consumer welfare standard, did lead to a lot of clarity and precision in the goals sort of and methods of antitrust. But now it is also the case that in general, we get the feeling that maybe this also led to much less skepticism when it comes to sort of the actual power of private enterprise, the power sort of big corporations, and that a lot of the sort of concentration that we see today, a lot of sort of the lack of autonomy, sort of and lost competition, is also due to exactly this development. I think when we think about sort of what does power actually mean sort of in the private and the economic sphere, I mean, most of the debates in antitrust is happening around the goals of antitrust, but I think particularly for me as a private lawyer, it's sometimes worth thinking about what these questions actually mean in the context of even larger institutions. So in private law as a whole, in the economic systems as a whole, and I've put two sort of pictures of two strange people up here, sort of, and Hegel and Schumpeter, because I think both of their work is remarkable for sort of explaining the power and the paradoxes of these two institutions. On the one hand, civil society, private law, what we would call in Germany die bürgerliche Gesellschaft, and then this free economic system. And I think both systems of private law and the economy, so going back to people such as Kant or Adam Smith, are sort of born in the same spirit. They're born in an extremely liberal spirit, where it's all about formal sort of liberal freedoms. It's all about putting sort of individuals at the core of civil society and economic systems, and enabling individuals to sort of accumulate welfare and lead the kind of lives that they want to lead. And I think it's in fact surprising sort of that very early on, and even a critic of this direction, Karl Marx, his writings are only sort of 100 years after Hegel, but very early on, this idea of power was actually seen as the biggest paradox and the biggest problem of any sort of liberal orders or institutions. And it was actually sort of Hegel that said that any sort of liberal free society has to give its individuals the ability to be as free as possible, to only sort of take care of their own needs and accumulate as much welfare as possible, but that the greatest problem with that was that it would inevitably result in power imbalances, in huge distributional problems, and that eventually these problems and paradoxes would become so large that civil society in and of itself would sort of undermine and destroy itself. And I have a similar reading sort of Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction, not only that entrepreneurs and people are innovative and creative and constantly developing new things, but that sort of with time, we would even grow reluctant to really see sort of the problems with monopoly power, because the only thing we would actually, because we would more read it as an indication that, you know, there is innovation, there is creative destruction. And so over the course of modernity, we would become ever less skeptical even of things such as monopoly power and huge power imbalances, because we can always justify them with the welfare of the individual or the creative destruction. So that's just sort of the larger idea, sort of what does power actually mean? And my reading of competition law and of competition policy, I think most of our private law systems tries to create sort of a liberal economic system where people enjoy a lot of freedoms, but we do need sort of distributional institutions too. And I think that the largest two fields of law that try to keep power in check, that try to introduce a balance, is both sort of antitrust law and labor law. And they should, if you think about their original intent and sort of what they actually mean in the broader context, should be read in that system. So what does this power sort of look like today, and why is it so troublesome? So as I said before, there is this accusation against antitrust or competition law and policy that we've done nothing to sort of control or prevent sort of the concentration, the huge power that we now see sort of in the digital sphere of these sort of big tech giants. And I think while that is true, I think the past 10 or 15 years have also, first of all, been a struggle to even understand what power this is. If you go back and you look at competition law commentaries and books from a couple of years ago, there's a quote that always stuck with me that said, competition takes place in markets, for markets, but never outside of markets. And I don't think that's true anymore. Most of these big platforms sort of are sort of conglomerates, and competition and their power is stretching sort of across markets. And we need a new terminology. And so I've put a couple of ideas, both from competition authorities as well as the literature, new ideas on how to understand and conceptualize this power. And that in future, the market power that we classically look at in competition law may only be sort of one facet of larger gatekeeper power, of a larger sort of ecosystem power. At the same time, and here sort of I'm particularly grateful for some research done in the Netherlands under the sort of title of modern bigness. They highlight that this isn't the kind of market power that we're used to anymore. It's not just about sort of higher prices or less output of goods. I think we all know that these big platforms, when we talk about the type of power that they also hold political power. They are capable of lobbying, of influencing political outcomes, maybe more so in the US, or there's more of a focus in the US than here. They have social power. They own the greatest sort of discourse or societal platforms such as Twitter. They have a huge influence on sort of the rules of political discourse, but also sort of the kind of content that we see. And then when we think about the autonomous sort of consumer and consumer welfare, we also have to acknowledge that they have a kind of normative power. They can set up the own rules of business, of marketplaces. They can nudge and steer consumers in certain directions. They can more or less determine sort of how much privacy we get on which platforms or not. And these are all facets of a new type of power, which a lot of people will say is not economic power. It's social power, it's coercive power, it's political power. It has nothing to do with competition policy. But at the same time, it's not true that it's not rooted in economics, and it's not true that it doesn't at least have huge effects sort of on economic questions, and that there's a huge sort of overlap. So, and again, I think the people that are doing this research on modern bigness are trying to find a language and a way of expressing what this new type of power sort of actually is, though they haven't sort of found a solution for it yet. I was listening to a talk by Fiona Scott Morton, who also said, well, if you just don't like companies being big, you could introduce laws sort of against bigness, but sort of competition law serves a different purpose. And so we're not at that point yet where we've said it's bigness in and of itself that's the problem, but it is a type of a power that is in the hands of very few people that seeps into all aspects of our lives and is inherently sort of economic. That is the problem. Again, what does competition law sort of classically do? Competition law classically, with all these types of power, some of them are novel or a bit new. Many of them have existed for hundreds of years. Competition law has classically only focused on sort of one smaller aspect of that power, and that's the sort of actually competitive power in sort of previously defined markets. There have been some attempts in the past to sort of broaden the scope of antitrust. There was a big, in the 1950s, here the quotes by Corwin Edwards, there was a big discussion sort of on what to do with companies that weren't just large in one market and weren't vertically integrated, but were large conglomerate firms such as General Electric. And we saw the same kind of rhetoric we're seeing again today, that these companies have the power to come into new markets, to push out newcomers, to destroy innovation, to influence politics, etc. But historical attempts, as far as I've known, I've spent sort of quite some time just looking at conglomerates, because for a long time I thought, well, aren't these platforms just a new form of conglomerates? But classically, sort of notions to sort of massively expand the notion of market power in competition law haven't worked thus far. What is going on at the moment in competition policy is an extremely interesting debate. I mean, first of all, there is a huge attack on, I suppose, the standard, this standard that has been the dominant standard in both EU and US competition law sort of over the past 15 to 20 years, the consumer welfare standard. Lots of people are saying it shouldn't be the focus of competition policy at all. Many people are saying it's far too narrow and should be broadened and needs reform. I would certainly say, if you look at competition law decisions that you disagree with or don't like, there's often just as many problems with market definition and other aspects as with a consumer welfare standard. But I would almost say there's starting to be some sort of consensus that the very narrow focus of the consumer welfare standard, at least only sort of on price, output, and efficiencies, needs to be broadened. And there's a search for new types of tests and standards in competition policy. And this is then also accompanied by sort of a general discussion on what the future goals of competition law should be. So whether competition law should only solely be focused on sort of competition or on sort of other goals that in Europe are also sort of in Article 3 of the Treaty of the European Union. Sort of the classic ones is whether competition law should be more aware of sustainability issues or labor issues. But the debate goes as far as to say, should we include gender or other equality issues into normal competition law analysis? This would obviously have the negative effect that to some extent, there would be some clarity that would go missing in competition policy. You can, of course, contend that and say public interests have always played a role, but competition policy does, according to my understanding or my view of things, have the benefit that you don't have to balance out things so much that you can't actually compare that easily. But those are sort of the general three debates. And this sort of leads me to my larger question: should competition law continue just to focus narrowly on market power and say, well, this is one aspect of the broader the notion of economic power that I've explored, but we'll just have to find sort of other instruments to focus on that? Or should competition law sort of broaden its scope? I think there's a lot to be said in favor of sort of competition law regaining its teeth and its strengths and opening up its scope somewhat. Certainly in all the cases where you can say that the normative power that you see or the power over privacy that you see in certain cases, in every case where that becomes a significant competitive parameter where rivalry is actually sort of based on these parameters, I would think that competition law needs to be broadened. And again, this is a debate that's happening sort of almost globally. Should competition law change? And the big alternative is obviously to let competition law keep its focus on market power and try to address these larger sort of economic power problems with regulation. I was looking back at a text, The Bounds of Power, from Amato, where he sort of compares again the US and the EU and says, well, the EU has always had this itch or this taste for regulation. I think has a lot to do with something that we see again today. Once something goes wrong in markets, it seems to automatically sort of restore our faith in governments, and at least from a European perspective, lead to this idea, well, now sort of regulation, the state has to play a larger role. And to some extent, I think in Europe now, with the passing of the DMA and the DSA, I think we've already made the decision that we're going to try to go sort of the regulatory route, which has benefits that it's far more specific and targeted, but also has sort of massive, but also sort of has, to my mind, larger problems that we haven't looked at yet. I think regulation is a very, very complex enterprise. I think if you look at the DMA and the DSA, I'm not sure that what you see in other fields of regulation, such as energy and financial markets, I'm not sure the legislative have taken into account the extremely strong sort of power sort of arbitrage and what can happen if companies that you're trying to regulate do not want to play by the rules and take other routes. I think it's a great thing with, I think it's Article 13 DMA, you can see clearly that they're trying to get control of arbitrage, whereas in financial markets, for example, it's just seen as something that is good and efficient. But equally, something such as capture. I mean, this in the 1960s, the Chicago School was against regulation because they said it always ends in capture. And I think, ironically, in the times of history where we've seen very little regulation or deregulation, this kind of maybe not capture, but what Bethany McLean calls the corruption that occurs when everybody thinks the same way. So people sort of working for the Federal Reserve, having exactly the same opinions on non-skepticism of financial markets as people working as Goldman Sachs. We see that this kind of capture is even larger when there is no regulation at all. So, I mean, I think that both competition and regulatory law should take on the challenge to sort of counteract economic power, to make sure that both civil society as well as economic systems sort of can flourish and don't undercut and ultimately just destroy themselves, which they would do if the power imbalances become too large. But that a lot of thinking obviously has to be done, not only about the correct goals, but also about the sort of correct tools and instruments. And I always tend to be in favor of very clear rules and as little complexity and sort of self-regulation and self-management as possible. But I think maybe that's something we can discuss now in the Q&A. Thank you.